California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerantz. We are coming to you from the Cannon House office building in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Tom McClintock. I'm sure you know him. He is a member of the United States Congress representing significant portions of Northern California. You've been here since 2008, spent 22 years in the state legislature in Sacramento. Give us a sense about the differences, the distinctions, the similarities.
Well, yeah, the process is completely different. I thought it'd be a pretty simple transition, and I realized I was at a great disadvantage because I first had to unlearn what I'd learned during 22 years in the state legislature.
Meaning what?
Well, you're dealing with a body of 435 members, and it's a body that has based all of its parliamentary practices not on the parliamentary manuals of the 19th century, as our state legislatures have, which are very structured, logical progressions of action. Instead, it's structured on Jefferson's manual, which uncharacteristically of him is simply an unorganized hodgepodge of observations of precedents from the early Congresses and from the Parliament. His was really the first parliamentary authority ever written down. So, and all the rules of the House have built up on that foundation rather than the foundations we typically think of when we talk about parliamentary process. And the size of the place, 435 members, is a much different deliberative dynamic than the 40 members of the state Senate, for example.
And what's interesting is Californians know you well as a strong conservative, especially on economic matters. And yet the term conservative has morphed over the last few years.
Well, it has, and I think a lot of that occurred during the Bush administration, which did some very, very unconservative things under the conservative banner, and now that definition is changing before our eyes. So those of us who become extremely concerned about blurring what once was a clear distinction between civilian and military authority, a very clear distinction between war and peace, are now considered, I guess, liberals, liberals, on these issues. But I've not changed my position. The position I have always taken is a strictly constitutional one.
So how does that feel for you then? That because your positions are the same, yet the perception of conservatism or the effectuation of conservatism has differed.
Interestingly, this is not the first time in our history this has happened. In fact, Abraham Lincoln once mused about the old Whig and Democratic parties literally changing their positions on the free soil issue 180 degrees in the span of a decade. He said it was like watching two drunken men fight their way into one another's overcoats. So this has happened before. It certainly will happen again.
Even with Democrats and Republicans, you think about early in the 20th century, the Democratic base was rock solid in the South. The Republican base was rock solid in the Northeast. We've seen the flip.
Very famous political scientist by the name of E.O. Key that basically theorized that about every 40 years or so this happens. So there's a very stable political coalition over 40 years over a very specific set agenda. And at the end of about a 40-year period, that agenda is no longer relevant to the issues at hand. It loses its grip over those coalitions. Those coalitions break apart. You have a period of enormous political instability. And if he stopped theorizing in the 1950s, but if you count his 40-year cycle, we're right back there again.
And let's talk about that, because there's no doubt that the Republican coalition is changing a bit. It really was, especially in California.
And by the way, the Democratic coalition changing as well.
No doubt. In California, it was really kind of an economic coalition, but now those forces are fraying on issues like immigration. Where does the Republican Party go from here?
Well, the central organizing philosophy of the Republican Party since its inception can be summarized in a single word: freedom. It's basically constitutionally limited government, individual liberty, and personal responsibility.
I'm Brad Pomerantz. This is California Edition.